Ada, a lazy lady, who loves eating outside because she is too lazy to cook. One day after eating in a restaurant, Ada, who was very pressed after she finished eating her food and urgently needed to ease herself. So she asked the waitress where the restroom was located and she was directed to the restroom. However, when she got there, it was already occupied by another customer and Ada couldn't hold it any longer. She saw a swinging door which led to the kitchen. When she peeped through the swinging door, she couldn't make much sense of what she saw, so she went through the door into the kitchen, and what she saw shocked her to the bone. It made her want to vomit. Everything was very dirty and irritating. There were a lot of dirty dishes piled up beside the cooking area. Raw meat was left out in the open with a dozen of flies patching on it. The women who were cooking the food had dirty hair and their white clothes were stained with all sort of things. It looked as if it hadn't been washed for a long time. The whole floor was dirty and filthy, and there were rats roaming freely all around. Then Ada saw the chief cook, a very fat dark woman, wearing a sleeveless gown. Her teeth were very brown, and the hair on her armpit were bushy and disgusting. Ada watched as the fat woman scratched her dirty armpit with the spoon she was using to cook and still used the same spoon to stir the soup without washing it. Ada felt very disgusted and she almost wanted to throw up. She held her stomach with one hand and used the other hand to cover her nose and mouth. Because of the smell, and the smell in the kitchen was very bad, she went back inside the restaurant feeling disappointed and irritated at the same time. When she left the restaurant, she rushed outside to vomit all that she had eaten. She couldn't believe what she just witnessed. Hello friends, welcome to African Tales Retold. Please subscribe to this channel and share the stories to others. By the way, to enable subtitles or captions, look for the CC icon on the video player. It will be located in the top right corner where subtitles are available. Now let's dive into the story. The bustling streets of Lagos were filled with honking cars, vendors shouting, and the thick aroma of street food. Ada weaved through the crowd, lazily scrolling through her phone, trying to decide what to eat for lunch. Cooking was the last thing on her mind. She hadn't even touched the stove in weeks. Why bother when there were dozens of food spots right outside her door? Her friend, Tolu, had texted her that morning, raving about a newly opened restaurant down the street. The food is cheap, and the portions are huge, Tolu had typed, along with a dozen exclamation points. Ada's mouth watered at the thought. She hadn't eaten a proper meal all day, and the idea of filling her stomach without lifting a finger was too good to resist. Maybe I'll give it a try, Ada mumbled to herself, shrugging off a vague feeling of unease. After all, what could go wrong? When she arrived at the restaurant, it looked ordinary. The paint on the signboard was faded, and the building had a slightly run-down look. Ada hesitated at the entrance, noticing a few flies hovering near the door. She almost turned around, but the aroma wafting from inside was enough to weaken her resolve. Spicy, savory, and mouth-watering, it reminded her of home-cooked meals, though she'd never had the patience to make them herself. She stepped inside, allowing the heavy door to close behind her with a soft thud. The interior was dimly lit, casting shadows across the tables and walls. There was a faint flickering light in one corner, and a couple of patrons sat silently, hunched over their meals. The place had an unusual smell, a mix of spices, oil, and something faintly sour that she couldn't quite place. Ada took a seat by the window, hoping to get some natural light, and waited for someone to take her order. As she settled in, she noticed small details that started to bother her. The table was sticky to the touch, and when she looked down, she saw crumbs scattered around, as though the table hadn't been wiped in a while. She frowned but brushed it off. After all, she was here for the food, not the ambience. A waitress shuffled over, a young woman who looked tired and worn out. Her uniform was wrinkled and stained, and her eyes had dark circles underneath. She barely looked at Ada, muttering, "What will you have?" Ada hesitated, wondering if she'd made a mistake coming here. But her hunger won out. "I'll have jollof rice with meat," she replied, trying to keep her voice cheerful. The waitress nodded and slunk back into the shadows of the kitchen, leaving Ada alone with her thoughts. She glanced around again, noticing more details, a thick layer of dust on the ceiling fan, an old water stain creeping across the ceiling, and the faint hum of flies near the door. Ada tried to ignore these things, focusing instead on the idea of a hot meal. But a nagging feeling had started to grow at the back of her mind, a subtle warning, like the faint sound of drums in the distance, echoing her mother's voice from childhood, "Be careful where you eat, Ada." Not every place is clean or safe. She brushed the memory away, chuckling to herself. I'm being paranoid, she thought. It's just a restaurant. How bad could it be? Just then, the waitress returned, setting a steaming plate of jollof rice and a piece of meat in front of her. The smell was intoxicating, but as Ada picked up her fork and took her first bite, a strange taste lingered on her tongue. It was slightly off, a bit gritty, almost like sand. She grimaced but swallowed, convincing herself it was just her imagination. Ada taking another bite, despite the uneasy feeling gnawing at her stomach. Her mind races with questions, but her hunger keeps her rooted to the spot. She is determined to finish her meal, even as an ominous shadow flickers near the kitchen door. As Ada continues eating, her discomfort grows. She's halfway through her meal when she notices something odd, a hair, coarse and thick, entangled in her rice. She pulls it out, her face twisting in disgust. She considers leaving but decides to push the plate aside and wait for the waitress. Her stomach feels uneasy, but she tells herself it's nothing serious. Minutes pass, and as she sits alone, she starts noticing odd behaviors around the restaurant. The other patrons eat quietly, almost robotically, as if they aren't even enjoying their food. The waitress moves in and out of the kitchen in a hurried, almost fearful manner, avoiding eye contact with the customers. Just as Ada is about to stand up and leave, she feels a sudden cramp in her stomach. She doubles over slightly, beads of sweat forming on her forehead. She realizes she needs to find a restroom quickly, or she won't be able to keep the food down. She waves the waitress over and asks for directions to the restroom. The waitress points to a door at the back, her voice low and cold. Over there, she mutters, and Ada shuffles toward it, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reaches the restroom, she finds it occupied. Desperation clawing at her, Ada glances around, her gaze landing on a swinging door with a small kitchen sign above it. She can hear muffled sounds behind the door, clanging pots, voices murmuring, the scrape of something heavy. Her curiosity piqued, Ada pushes the door open, hoping to find another way through to a restroom. What she sees inside makes her heart race. With Ada standing on the threshold of the kitchen, feeling a mixture of nausea and horror as she tries to make sense of the chaotic, filthy scene unfolding before her. Ada stands frozen in the doorway, staring into the kitchen. Her eyes widen as they take in the scene before her. The kitchen is nothing like she imagined, it's filthy, and the smell hits her like a punch to the gut. Dirty dishes are piled high in the sink, covered in thick, greenish mold. The counters are smeared with leftover food and grease, attracting flies that buzz around lazily. In the corner, she sees a bucket filled with what looks like spoiled, rotting food scraps. Her stomach lurches as she breathes in the rancid odor, so overwhelming it nearly brings tears to her eyes. Ada glances around, hoping she's mistaken, but every detail only confirms the horror. Raw meat lies out on a cutting board, grayish and covered in flies, with a pungent odor seeping into the air. She watches as a cockroach scuttles across the floor, disappearing under the filthy stove. The whole scene feels like something out of a nightmare. Just then, she hears a sound, a woman's voice, grumbling to herself. Ada quickly hides behind the door as a large, dark-skinned woman steps into view. The woman is wearing a sleeveless gown that's stained and yellowed, her hair greasy and unkempt. Ada's stomach twists in disgust as she watches the woman lift her arm, scratching her armpit with a large, dirty spoon. Without missing a beat, the woman dips the same spoon into a pot of soup, stirring it with an oblivious expression. Ada feels bile rising in her throat. She turns away, clamping a hand over her mouth to stop herself from retching. Her mind races, is this what she's been eating? Is this how they prepare their food here? She takes a step back, her heart pounding with fear and disgust, feeling an overwhelming urge to flee. With Ada standing paralyzed in horror, realizing that she's been eating food prepared in this grotesque kitchen. The smell, the dirt, the flies, everything combines into a horrifying realization that leaves her questioning her every decision. Ada inches backward, careful not to make a sound. She watches in horrified fascination as two other women enter the kitchen, both dressed in equally dirty, stained clothing. One of them has tangled hair tied up with a greasy rag, and the other's face is streaked with sweat and dirt. They chat with each other as they work, one of them chopping vegetables on a filthy cutting board, and the other picking up a piece of meat from the floor as if it's the most normal thing in the world. Ada notices rats scurrying along the edges of the room, undisturbed by the staff's presence. The floor is covered in smudges and dried stains, as if it hasn't been cleaned in weeks. She's so stunned by the sight that she barely notices the chief cook approaching the stove, pouring a ladle of soup into a bowl and sprinkling something from a dirty container on top. The woman's face twists into a smile as she tastes the soup, oblivious to the filth surrounding her. Ada shudders, feeling her stomach churning again. She can't believe she's been eating food from this kitchen, food prepared by these unsanitary hands. She can't hold back her nausea any longer and bolts out of the kitchen, praying no one hears her. As she stumbles back into the restaurant's main room, she sees other diners eating their meals, oblivious to what's happening behind the scenes. She feels a wave of horror wash over her as she realizes that everyone here is consuming food tainted by filth and carelessness. With Ada making a decision to leave as quickly as possible. But her stomach cramps sharply, and she realizes she might not be able to escape the consequences of her meal so easily. Ada reaches the door to the restaurant and stumbles outside, gasping for fresh air. The harsh sunlight hits her, a stark contrast to the dim, dirty atmosphere of the restaurant. She doubles over, her stomach twisting painfully as she struggles to keep her food down. Her mind replays the grotesque images from the kitchen, the filthy counters, the rats, the spoon in the armpit, and she can't hold it in any longer. She turns to the side and vomits, retching out the entire contents of her stomach. Passers-by glance at her in concern, but she barely notices them. All she can think about is the horror she just witnessed. The nausea fades slightly, but the feeling of disgust remains, clawing at her insides. She can't believe she let herself be tempted by the allure of a cheap, easy meal. She curses herself, her laziness, and her impulsive decision to ignore her mother's warnings. As she catches her breath, Ada tries to shake off the experience, but the memory feels burned into her mind. She stares back at the restaurant, watching as new customers enter, blissfully unaware of what they're walking into. For a moment, she considers going back inside to warn them, but her body is too weak, and she's too embarrassed to draw attention to herself. With Ada standing on the sidewalk, wondering how many others have fallen victim to this restaurant's unsanitary practices. She swears to herself that she'll never eat out so carelessly again, but the trauma of what she saw has already started to settle deep in her mind, haunting her. After the incident, Ada struggles to put the experience behind her. She spends the next few days recovering, unable to eat anything without feeling queasy. Even the smell of food makes her stomach turn. She lies in bed, replaying the images of the filthy kitchen in her mind. Every detail seems sharper, more vivid, the flies, the grime, the unwashed hands preparing her meal. She tries to go about her daily routine, but the trauma lingers. She avoids walking past that part of the street and develops a paranoia toward other restaurants as well. Her friends invite her out to eat, but she declines, making excuses about feeling unwell. Eventually, Ada decides to share her story with Tolu, the friend who had recommended the restaurant. They meet at a cafe, and Ada describes her experience in hushed tones, her voice trembling as she recounts every horrific detail. Tolu listens, horrified, her eyes widening with each sentence. "You mean, you actually saw them preparing food like that?" Tolu asks, barely able to believe it. Ada nods, her face pale. "It was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. I almost can't believe I ate there." With Tolu's shocked reaction, and Ada feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. She's glad to have shared her experience, but she knows the memory will stay with her, haunting her for a long time to come. Ada's experience has left her with a lasting sense of paranoia about eating out. Every restaurant, no matter how clean or reputable, now seems suspicious in her eyes. She begins to inspect every plate, every fork, every spoon, fearing she might spot some hint of the filth she witnessed that day. Her friends notice her change in behavior, laughing at her sudden pickiness, but she can't shake the fear. One evening, she overhears her friends planning to visit another new restaurant, and she feels a wave of anxiety rise within her. She tries to dissuade them, recalling everything she saw, but they brush it off, saying she's overreacting. Her friends laugh, but Ada can only force a smile. the memory of that filthy kitchen lingers in her mind, and she feels trapped between wanting to join her friends and the overwhelming fear of witnessing something similar again. With Ada's friends eagerly discussing the new restaurant, while Ada sits quietly, battling her growing paranoia and the dark memories she can't escape. Ada's experience at the restaurant begins to haunt her in more ways than one. At night, she's plagued by vivid nightmares that replay the scenes she witnessed in the kitchen. She dreams of the filthy counters, the rats scurrying around, and the chief cook stirring pots with the same spoon she used to scratch her armpit. In these dreams, she feels trapped, unable to escape the kitchen no matter how fast she runs. Each time, she wakes up drenched in sweat, her heart racing, her stomach twisting in revulsion. The nightmares become a nightly ordeal, depriving her of sleep and affecting her work. She arrives at the office bleary-eyed, barely able to focus, and her colleagues notice the change in her. When they ask what's wrong, she brushes it off, too embarrassed to tell them the truth. One night, the nightmare takes an even darker turn. In her dream, she's back in the restaurant, eating her meal as the flies buzz around her. But this time, the chief cook approaches her table, grinning with her yellow, crooked teeth. She places a new dish in front of Ada, lifting the lid to reveal a plate writhing with maggots. Ada tries to scream, but no sound escapes her lips. She feels paralyzed, forced to watch as the maggots wriggle closer and closer. Ada wakes up gasping, clutching her sheets, her skin cold and clammy. She realizes that her trauma runs deeper than she thought, and that it's affecting her in ways she hadn't anticipated. With Ada sitting on the edge of her bed, trembling and exhausted, wondering if she'll ever be able to escape the haunting memory of that day. Unable to bear the nightmares and paranoia any longer, Ada decides to confide in someone she trusts, her older sister, Ifeoma. She invites Ifeoma over for tea, trying to find the courage to share her ordeal. When Ifeoma arrives, Ada hesitates, feeling foolish for letting the experience get to her so deeply. But as she begins to tell her story, the words pour out, along with all the fear and disgust she's been bottling up. Ifeoma listens patiently, nodding as Ada describes every detail, the filth, the rats, the chef's revolting habits. When Ada finishes, Ifeoma reaches across the table, squeezing her hand. Ada, I'm so sorry you went through that, Ifeoma says gently. But maybe it's time to consider seeing a therapist. This experience has affected you deeply, and you need help moving past it. Ada feels a mixture of relief and embarrassment. She hadn't thought her experience would warrant therapy, but as Ifeoma talks about trauma and the effects it can have, she begins to see things differently. She realizes that her nightmares and paranoia won't go away on their own, and that she needs to confront her fears instead of burying them. With Ada reluctantly agreeing to look into therapy, hoping that facing her trauma head-on will finally free her from the horrors that haunt her. Ada books her first therapy session, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. She meets Dr. Femi, a calm and understanding psychologist with a reassuring presence. They sit in a cozy office with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, and Ada begins to relax, feeling like she's in a safe space for the first time since her traumatic experience. Dr. Femi listens intently as Ada recounts her story, her voice trembling as she relives the moment she stepped into the kitchen. She talks about the nightmares, the constant paranoia, and the sense of dread that has taken over her life. Dr. Femi nods, occasionally asking gentle questions to help her process her feelings. Trauma can manifest in many ways, Dr. Femi explains after Ada finishes. Your experience triggered a strong reaction because it violated a sense of safety you had in everyday life. Eating is supposed to be a safe, nourishing activity, but what you saw shattered that trust. Ada listens, feeling understood in a way she hadn't before. Dr. Femi suggests some techniques to help her cope with the anxiety, including grounding exercises and journaling to express her feelings. She leaves the session feeling lighter, hopeful that she might finally be on a path to healing. With Ada looking forward to her next therapy session, determined to take control of her life again and find peace. In the days following her therapy session, Ada begins to challenge herself in small ways. She tries to cook simple meals at home, an activity she used to avoid out of laziness. At first, she feels anxious, imagining the dirt and filth from that restaurant somehow invading her kitchen. But she pushes through, reminding herself that she's in control of her environment. She starts with small, simple dishes, a bowl of rice, a fried egg, a vegetable stir-fry. As she cooks, she carefully cleans every surface, washing her hands multiple times, ensuring that everything is spotless. The process is slow and meticulous, but it begins to give her a sense of comfort and control that she hasn't felt in a long time. Gradually, Ada starts to regain her appetite, finding solace in the meals she prepares for herself. Each dish feels like a small victory, a step away from the trauma that used to consume her. She realizes that cooking her own meals is a way of reclaiming her power, of proving to herself that she doesn't need to rely on others for food. With Ada finishing a home-cooked meal, feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment she hasn't felt in months. As Ada continues her journey of healing, she begins to develop a new appreciation for cleanliness and health. She becomes more cautious about where she eats, researching each restaurant before deciding to visit. Her friends notice the change in her, but instead of brushing off her concerns, they begin to listen to her, realizing that her experience has given her a unique perspective. Ada starts sharing her story with others, warning them about the importance of hygiene and health in the places they eat. She writes a blog post about her experience, detailing everything she witnessed and the lessons she learned. Her post goes viral, resonating with others who have had similar experiences. She begins to receive messages from people who thank her for raising awareness, for reminding them to be mindful of where they eat. In a strange way, Ada feels a sense of purpose in sharing her story. She realizes that by speaking out, she's helping others avoid the same trauma, and that gives her a sense of closure. With Ada feeling a renewed sense of strength and purpose, knowing that her experience has made her stronger and more resilient. One day, as Ada is running errands in a different part of the city, she spots a familiar face, the chief cook from that restaurant. The woman is standing outside a new establishment, dressed in a cleaner uniform, but Ada can't forget her face. A chill runs down her spine as she watches the woman greet customers with a smile, directing them into the restaurant. Ada feels a surge of anger and disgust, realizing that this woman is now working at a new place, likely spreading the same unsanitary practices. She debates what to do, her heart pounding with fear and frustration. She doesn't want anyone else to go through what she did, but confronting the woman feels overwhelming. With Ada standing across the street, torn between walking away and stepping forward to stop the woman from causing more harm. After a moment of indecision, Ada pulls out her phone and calls the local health department, reporting the establishment and explaining what she witnessed at the previous restaurant. She feels a wave of relief wash over her as she explains everything, knowing she's taking action to prevent another person from experiencing her nightmare. Days later, she hears from a friend that the restaurant was shut down for health violations. Ada feels a quiet satisfaction, realizing that her decision to speak up has made a difference. With Ada feeling empowered, knowing that her actions helped to protect others from experiencing the trauma she endured. She walks away with a sense of closure, finally ready to move on with her life.